When Clara and Emily decided to enter a cave that had only recently been discovered, they found themselves in the scariest situation imaginable. There was a reason this cave held its identity and its secrets hidden away for so long. The horror inside would not release its victims so easily. Clara and Emily were inseparable. They met in college, two kindred spirits who quickly bonded over their love for adventure. Weekends were often spent hiking through forests and exploring abandoned buildings, their fearless curiosity leading them to places others dared not go. The two friends shared everything, their laughter echoing in places they explored, their bond growing stronger with each shared experience. One summer, Claire suggested they explore the old cave system that was rumored to rest on the outskirts of town. Recently discovered, this cave was the ideal place for Clara and Emily to scratch their itch for danger. Rumor had it that the caves were endless, a labyrinth where so few had entered and even fewer had returned. Emily, ever the enthusiast, eagerly agreed. They packed their gear and set off, excitement buzzing between them like electricity. As they approached the cave entrance, Clara felt a shiver of apprehension, but Emily's enthusiasm was infectious. "This is going to be our best adventure yet," Emily declared, her eyes shining with excitement. Clara smiled, her doubts momentarily forgotten. "Yeah, it will be," she agreed, gripping her flashlight tightly as they stepped into the cave's dark maw. If you're new here or haven't done so yet, go ahead and hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications to stay up to date when I release new videos. I upload spooky stories of the paranormal at least once a week, sometimes 2 to 3 times, and I have many more in the works. You won't want to miss them. Now, back to the story. The entrance to the cave yawned before them, a dark mouth ready to swallow them whole. Dark, yet with an insatiable pull that beckoned to the women. The cave's breath gusted cool air, enveloping the pair. Both ignored the chills that accompanied the disturbing feeling. They entered the cave's dark, grotesque mouth, their flashlights piercing the gloom. The air was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of earth and stone. Hours passed as they wound their way deeper into the earth, the passages twisting and turning in an endless maze. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the occasional drip of water echoing through the tunnels. Let's turn back," Clara finally suggested, her voice echoing off the damp walls. The initial thrill of exploration had given way to a growing sense of unease. But Emily, her eyes gleaming with a strange fervor, urged them onward. "Just a little further," Emily insisted. "I feel like we're close to something amazing." Reluctantly, Clara followed. They pressed on until they reached a vast open chamber. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like the fangs of a giant beast, and an underground river cut through the stone, its dark waters flowing silently. The sight was breathtaking, and for a moment Clara forgot her fear. "This is incredible," Emily breathed, her voice filled with awe. But Clara's unease grew. She glanced at her watch and realized it had stopped hours ago. Panic bubbled within her, and they had been down there for too long. "We need to go back," Clara said firmly, her voice trembling slightly. "Now!" Emily turned to her, her face shadowed in the dim light. "Don't be such a coward, Clara. We haven't even seen the best part yet." Suddenly, a low rumble filled the chamber, and the ground beneath them shook. Clara's heart raced as she grabbed Emily's arm, trying to pull her back towards the way they came. But the cave had other plans. With a deafening roar, the ceiling began to collapse. Clara screamed, diving for cover as rocks fell all around her. Darkness enveloped her, the weight of the earth pressing down. When she awoke, the silence was absolute. Her flashlight lay shattered beside her, its beam reduced to a flicker. Clara called out for Emily, but there was no response. She was alone. Painstakingly, Clara dug herself free from the rubble, her body bruised and battered. She stumbled through the cave, her mind a fog of fear and confusion. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a whisper of something sinister. The realization that she might never find her way out gnawed at her mind, and she clung to the hope that Emily was still somewhere nearby. Days passed. Clara's sense of time dissolved into a blur of hunger, thirst, and desperation. She spoke to Emily, imagining her voice guiding her, comforting her. They were going to find a way out together. But as Clara wandered deeper into the cave, she began to notice something strange. There were no signs of Emily. No footprints, no dropped gear, nothing. The realization hit her like a blow. Emily wasn't real. She never had been. Clara collapsed, the weight of her discovery crushing her spirit. Emily had been a figment of her imagination, a creation born of loneliness and fear. All those adventures, all those conversations, they were Clara's desperate attempts to fill the void of her own isolation. The truth began to unravel in Clara's mind, each thread revealing the depths of her delusion. She had created Emily in college, a time when she felt most alone and vulnerable. The friend who had shared her adventures, her dreams, and her fears was nothing more than a construct of her own fractured psyche. Clara's heart ached with the loss, the realization that she had been alone all along. As she lay there, the darkness pressed in, whispering truths she had tried to deny. Clara was not a fearless adventurer. She was a lost, broken soul, trapped in her own mind as much as in this cave. The echoes of her own voice mocked her, the shadows around her twisting into forms of her fears. Her body weakened, her hope extinguished. Clara curled up on the cold stone floor, her last thoughts drifting to the imaginary friend who had accompanied her for so long. In the end, it was not the cave that had trapped her, but her own mind. The days that followed were a blur of delirium and despair. Clara's physical needs were overwhelmed by the crushing weight of her realization. She wandered aimlessly through the cave, her flashlight long dead, guided only by the dim, ghostly light reflecting off the walls. The boundaries between reality and hallucination blurred as Clara's mind descended into madness. She saw Emily everywhere, in the shadows, in the reflections on the water, in the patterns of the rocks. Emily's voice, once a source of comfort, now taunted her, whispering dark truths and reminding her of her isolation. The cave seemed to close in on her, its walls pressing tighter and tighter, suffocating her with the weight of her own mind. Clara's body grew weaker, her steps faltering. She could no longer distinguish between the echoes of her own footsteps and the imagined sounds of Emily following her. The cave became a nightmarish landscape, twisting and warping in ways that defied logic. Time lost all meaning. Minutes stretched into hours, then days. Her food and water as dry as her false memories of Emily. Her once sharp mind was now a fog of confusion and terror. She no longer knew if she was moving deeper into the cave or circling back on herself. Every tunnel looking the same, every chamber a repeat of the last. The sense of impending doom grew stronger with each passing moment, the walls whispering secrets she couldn't understand. One day, or perhaps night, Clara couldn't tell anymore. She stumbled upon a pool of water. Her reflection stared back at her, gaunt and hollow-eyed. She reached out to touch the surface, but the image of Emily appeared beside her own, a spectral presence in the water. Clara, Emily's voice was soft, almost tender. Why did you abandon me? Clara recoiled, her mind teetering on the brink. I never meant to, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I thought you were real. Emily's reflection smiled, a sad and haunting expression. I was real to you, and that's what mattered. Clara sank to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. I can't do this anymore. I'm so tired, Emily. The reflection of Emily faded, leaving Clara alone with her thoughts. The cave seemed to sigh around her, the oppressive silence returning. Clara's strength was nearly gone, her will to survive eroded by the relentless assault of her own mind. With a final desperate effort, Clara pushed herself to her feet. She had to keep moving, had to find a way out. She stumbled through the tunnels, each step an agony, her vision blurring as exhaustion took its toll. In her final moments, Clara found herself back in the vast chamber where it all began. The underground river still flowing silently, a dark, endless current. She collapsed by the water's edge, her body too weak to continue. The darkness closed in, but this time it was not the cave's darkness. It was her own. Clara's thoughts drifted back to the life she had once known, the adventures she had shared with Emily, or so she thought, the laughter and the companionship. Even if it had all been a lie, it had been a beautiful one, a fantasy that had given her a sense of purpose and connection. As the darkness claimed her, Clara felt a strange sense of peace. She was no longer alone, no longer fighting against the truth. She let go of her fears, her regrets, and her pain. The cave remained silent, its secrets buried deep, and somewhere in its endless corridors, the ghost of Clara's imagination lingered, a reminder of the dark places the mind can go when left alone for too long. The world outside continued, unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded deep within the earth. Clara's story became just another rumor, another tale to be told around campfires. But in the heart of the cave, her spirit remained, a silent witness to the power of the human mind and the fragility of the human soul. It was a town so small it barely appeared on maps, nestled deep in a valley where the sun only touched briefly each day. In this forgotten place lived a man named Thomas Gray, a quiet, unassuming figure who preferred the solace of his old, creaking house to the bustling lives of his neighbors. Thomas's house was an imposing structure, seeming more ancient than it was, ancient and looming, sitting at the edge of the town like a sentinel, but Thomas held a secret. The townsfolk whispered about Thomas and his wife Eleanor, whom no one had seen in years. They spoke of Eleanor's unnatural abilities, claiming she could bend the will of anyone within her mental reach. Some called her a witch, others a demon, but all agreed that she was to be feared. Thomas lived in perpetual twilight, shrouded by the dark history of his wife and the chilling aura that clung to their home. The townspeople's avoidance only deepened his isolation. He often found himself talking to Eleanor, though she never really replied due to the stroke she had suffered a few years prior. Their conversations were one-sided, filled with memories of better days and the dark twist that had turned their love into a town's nightmare. At first, the whispers seemed like petty gossip, but soon Thomas couldn't ignore the odd occurrences around him. Neighbors he'd known for years started acting strangely, as if their minds weren't their own anymore. It was subtle at first, a strange look in their eyes, a sudden shift in behavior, and unexplained hostility or compliance. Thomas began to suspect that Eleanor's powers were real, that she was somehow projecting her will across the town. It started with Mr. Carter, who had always been a kind and gentle soul. One day he turned up at the town square, shouting obscenities and accusing the townsfolk of plotting against him. His eyes were wild, his movements erratic. When Thomas tried to calm him down, Carter looked through him as if he didn't exist and ran off into the woods, never to be seen again. Thomas tried to confront Eleanor about the townspeople's fears, but the house seemed to swallow his words, the echoes of his pleas bouncing off the walls and disappeared into the shadowy corners. Eleanor never emerged from her room on the top floor, and Thomas began to dread the times when he had to climb the stairs to deliver her meals. As the days passed, the influence of Eleanor's unseen hand grew stronger. People began to vanish without a trace, leaving only eerie silence in their wake. Thomas's suspicions turned to terror. What if Eleanor wasn't just manipulating their thoughts, but driving them to their doom? Mrs. Thompson, the school teacher, was the next to fall under Eleanor's spell. She had always been patient and nurturing, but one day she snapped. In the middle of a lesson, she began screaming at the children, accusing them of conspiring to fail her. She stormed out of the classroom, leaving the children in tears. That night, she was found wandering the streets, muttering to herself about voices in her head. Witnesses watched as she stumbled her way out of town. The next morning, the class had a new teacher. One night, the tension reached a breaking point. Thomas awoke to the sound of whispers, a chorus of disembodied voices filling his mind. He stumbled through the house, calling out to Eleanor, but received no answer, as usual. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they formed coherent words, urging him to find her, to end the nightmare. Driven by fear and desperation, Thomas burst into Eleanor's room. The bed was empty, covered in dust. The room smelled of decay and abandonment. Thomas's heart raced as he searched the room, finding nothing but old photographs and mementos of a life that felt increasingly unreal. His legs shook and the room seemed to spin around him. The next morning, he awoke on the floor next to the bed, with Eleanor staring down at him from where she was always at, smiling devilishly. He quickly got up, kissed her forehead, and exited the room. In the following days, the town fell further into chaos. People turned on each other, convinced that their neighbors were under Eleanor's spell. Thomas watched helplessly as the peaceful community he had known disintegrated into paranoia and violence. He became a recluse, locking himself in the house, afraid of the unseen force that seemed to be orchestrating the madness from within his own home. Eleanor's manipulations became more sinister. The town's baker, Mr. Hughes, suddenly developed a violent temper. He was known for his generosity, always offering free bread to those in need. But under Eleanor's influence, he began hoarding his goods, accusing customers of trying to steal from him. When confronted by the sheriff, Hughes attacked him with a rolling pin, screaming about voices that commanded him to protect his bakery. His bakery closed down shortly after, and Mr. Hughes was never heard from again, like so many others. One stormy night, Thomas made a fateful decision. He would confront Eleanor one last time and demand the truth. Armed with a lantern and his wavering resolve, he climbed the stairs to her room. With every painful step, his heart pounded harder. By the time he was outside his wife's door, he could feel his pulse in his temples. As he opened the door, a gust of wind extinguished his lantern, plunging him into darkness. Thomas fumbled for a match, his fingers trembling as he struck it against the box. The flickering light revealed a figure standing by the window, her back to him. It was Eleanor, or what he thought was Eleanor. She turned slowly, her face obscured by shadows, and spoke in a voice that seemed to echo from the walls. "I know what you want. You're too late, Thomas. They're all mine now." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. He stepped forward, the match lit, casting eerie shadows around the room. "What have you done, Eleanor? Why are you doing this?" Eleanor's laughter filled the room, a sound that sent shivers down Thomas's bones. "You don't understand, do you? They were always mine. I'm simply reminding them of that." Thomas's mind raced. What did she mean? How could she have such power? He wanted to flee, to escape the madness, but he was rooted to the spot, unable to tear his eyes away from the spectral figure before him. In a desperate attempt to break free from the nightmare, Thomas lunged at Eleanor, but his hands passed through her as if she were made of smoke. He stumbled and fell, his match extinguished, plunging him into darkness. Thomas lay on the floor, gasping for breath, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. He felt a presence looming over him, cold and oppressive. Slowly, he pushed himself up and reached for the door, intending to flee the cursed room. But as he turned the handle, the door wouldn't budge. He was trapped. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. They filled his mind, urging him to surrender, to join Eleanor in her twisted dominion. Thomas clamped his hands over his ears, but the voices only grew louder, drowning out his own thoughts. In a final act of desperation, Thomas screamed into the void, "What do you want from me?" Silence fell thick and heavy, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing. Then a voice, clear and unmistakable, echoed through the room.
"You've always known, Thomas. You just refused to see."
The room began to spin, the walls closing in around him. This poor, frail old man. Thomas felt as if he were being pulled into a vortex, a maelstrom of memories and emotions. He closed his eyes, trying to anchor himself in reality, but the boundaries between past and present, real and imagined, began to blur. As the storm in his mind subsided, Thomas found himself standing in a different room altogether, one he recognized from years ago. It was their bedroom, from before Eleanor's death. Eleanor lay in bed, frail and pale, her life slipping away. Thomas stood by her side, holding her hand, tears streaming down his face. "Don't leave me," he pleaded, with his voice breaking. "I can't do this without you." Eleanor's eyes, once vibrant, were now dull and distant. "You have to let go, Thomas. You have to live." Thomas shook his head, refusing to accept the inevitable. "No, I won't. I can't." As Eleanor took her final breath, the room faded, and Thomas found himself back in the present, alone in the darkness. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Eleanor was gone. She had been gone for years. The whispers, the manipulation, the chaos, it had all been in his mind. He had been projecting his grief and guilt onto the town, creating an elaborate fantasy to avoid facing the truth. The townspeople, the strange occurrences, even Eleanor's ghostly presence, were all figments of his tortured imagination. Thomas sank to the floor, overwhelmed by the weight of his revelation. He had been living a lie, trapped in a prison of his own making. The house, once a sanctuary, had become his purgatory. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, the sun began to rise, casting its first light on the valley. For the first time in years, Thomas felt a glimmer of hope. He could break free from the shadows of his past. Thomas rose slowly, his body aching but his spirit lighter. He opened the door to Eleanor's room and stepped out into the hallway. The house seemed different, less oppressive, as if a weight had been lifted. He walked through each room, opening windows and letting the light in, dispelling the darkness that had held him captive for so long. Then it hit him like a ton of bricks. If Eleanor was gone all this time, who or what was manifesting in the minds of the people in town? What unseen force was manipulating those around him? The curtains seemed to draw themselves closed, followed by the horrible oppression, sadness, darkness, his mind spinning with madness, as if his thoughts weren't of his own. Then the voice, and this time it wasn't that of his beloved wife. Deep, sinister.
"It's you, Thomas. It's always been you all along."
The memories came back to him in a whirlwind of chaos. His grief had driven him to insanity. The guilt of what he had done washing over him like boiling water, burning him inside and out. All the people he had manipulated, all those missing, all his fault. His mind cluttered with the pain of losing his wife and hurting everyone around him, for it was too much to bear. Thomas ran to the windows and threw back the curtains of each one again, not paying attention to anything other than getting light into his ancient home. But at the last window of the second floor, Thomas stopped. He opened the window to proclaim the nightmare was over to anyone within earshot. But when he did, there was no one there. No people, no town, just the wilderness around him, encasing him, containing him. The town had never been real. There was no town, no missing school teacher, no angry baker. It was all in his mind. Some years later, a group of hikers stumbled upon an old house in the middle of the forest. It looked as if it was never meant to be discovered, and time was not kind to this home. With a curious nature, two of the hikers decided to look inside. The rotted wood door creaked open in pain, as if to scream to its occupants, warning them someone was intruding. As the hikers entered the rundown home, they felt the darkness grab them like an icy blanket. But there, on the floor of the first room, was the skeletal remains of Thomas Gray, still clutching a revolver in his bony fingers. Thomas had taken his own life, and no one knew. Darwin Moore sat in the corner of the attic of the rundown, abandoned house, curled in a fetal position, making sure the moonlight was not touching any part of him. The eerie moonlight was poking through the gapped boards of the roof, leaving streaks of a bluish light highlighting the dust in the air and the old wooden floor in front of him. The light stretched from one side of the attic to the other. There was no way to cross the room to the stairs without severing the connection the light had with the dark upper room of this late 18th century home. He sat trying to calm his breath and his shaking body, doing his best not to let out even the slightest sound. But he was so terrified that he couldn't control himself completely. He just hoped that he was quiet enough that nothing would discover his hiding spot. He just had to make it through the hours remaining of the night. As the moon rose higher, the light streaks shifted, pulling the blue iridescent glow across one of his feet. Slowly, Darwin tried to pull his foot back into the shadow. Holding his hand over his mouth, he tried to keep his balance as he shifted his weight to bring his foot back. But his fear got the best of him. A cramp in his foot caused him to slip. He crashed onto the floor. His bottom made a loud thud on the rotting floorboards, jostling a fine mist of dust from the walls and ceiling, penetrating the bands of light falling from the roof. His foot slid out from under him, and his leg was caught in the light cast by the almost full moon through the cracks and crevices of the roof. Suddenly, a thumping of heavy footsteps came charging up the stairs on the other side of the attic. Darwin retreated every part of his body back into the shadow and awaited the inevitable. Darwin Moore grew up in rural Indiana, among the cornfields and flat countryside. He was always the curious sort. Even as a young child, he would explore the cornfields of his parents' farm and venture into the woods alone, which surrounded the farm on three sides. He would wait until his parents were tending the farm or otherwise preoccupied and slip away. His two older brothers and one older sister weren't as free-spirited. They would help out around the homestead as much as they could, learning how to work the land and ultimately how to take over when their parents decided they were too old to continue the work. But Darwin, he knew at an early age farming wasn't for him. He wasn't cut from the same cloth as his siblings, and his parents knew it as well. By the time Darwin reached 10 years old, the local law enforcement knew him by name from the many times they had to go searching for him. But they knew him as Jonathan Moore. Darwin was somewhat of a nickname his siblings gave him due to his adventurous spirit. When rescuers would bring Darwin back home, he would insist he wasn't lost. He just wasn't good at keeping track of time. When Darwin turned 11, his father took him to their church where members were starting a survival training for young boys. Most of the other kids joining weren't able to learn skills from their parents as they had become orphans one way or another. Darwin was one of the few exceptions. Originally, this was meant to give orphans a fighting chance when they would grow too old for the orphanage and need to make a way for themselves in the wild country. But given Darwin's reputation for escapism, the church offered to take him on board. They felt at least he would have some knowledge of how to survive in the wild and how to return back home. The program was to begin every Friday and last throughout the weekend. They didn't really have a plan for how many weeks it would take, or even if it would continue past the first weekend. It was all going to be trial and error. One of the instructors was a former tracker and fur trader named Brock, but everyone called him Bronco on account of seeing him tame a wild horse one time. The nickname fit, and he didn't mind it. It made him feel like a wild man. The other was an amateur explorer named James, but everyone called him Buster. There was no rhyme nor reason for his nickname. It just seemed like everyone needed a nickname that made them seem tough. Their job was simple, but not easy. Take the young boys into the wilderness and show them how to survive, is what the pastor of the church told them. It was clear that Darwin had a knack for this kind of thing in the first weekend. He was a scrawny kid, but he was stronger than he looked. He preferred the company of the instructors more than the other kids. He would pick their brains for everything they were willing to show him, and he absorbed this knowledge more than the other students did. He genuinely loved being in this environment. During the day, they would be taught how to build a shelter for themselves. There would be no sharing, as this was all about surviving alone. Hunting and foraging was another of the tasks they would learn during the daylight hours. At night, they would sit around the fire, enjoying the fruits of their labors. Of the 5 young men, Darwin was the only one who didn't complain at any given moment. When dinner was finished, they would take an hour or so and sit around the campfire as the adults would tell stories. Nothing too scary. The boys had to sleep alone after all, and they didn't really need whiny kids trying to join them in their shelter in the middle of the night. At least not until the boys were accustomed to being out on their own. And they had plenty of stories that could scare the boys. Some true, some just passed along by travelers. Beginning the second weekend, the campsite was complete. All the boys had their makeshift shelters of lumber and foliage around in such a way that it was beginning to look like a small town for small people. The boys were also becoming a little more self-sufficient, but no precaution was to be skipped. They still were not allowed venturing out alone, even though this was meant to teach them how to survive alone. The instructors didn't need the headache that would come with searching for a lost child. They were learning, but they weren't quite at that point yet. Darwin had been holding on to something he had been wanting to ask the adults, and on the final night of the second weekend, he finally got the opportunity to ask about it. Sitting around the fire, having their last meal of the day, there was a pause between the stories the men were telling. Darwin was always bold with them. "Tell us about the Jasper place," Darwin demanded. The 2 men looked at each other and chuckled. Bronco was the first to speak. "You mean the Harper place?" "I don't think so, kid. That's just an old wives' tale, and we don't need any of you peeing the bed tonight." Darwin gave them a cross look. "That's not what I heard. I heard it's real. I heard people go missing around there, that the house even disappears after it takes someone." The men chuckled again. "Sounds like you know everything we know. The house ain't far from here. Word is, more than 10 men have been lost there." Buster interjected. "I hear it was more like 20 men. "That's more than 10, ain't it?" he hit back. "That's enough for tonight. Y'all go to bed. We got an early morning tomorrow." That night, Darwin laid in the cot he made out of branches tied together. The night was warm, and he just laid there with his eyes open, thinking of the mystery of the Harper property. He wanted to hear so much more about it, and he could tell the adults were hiding something. Was there a squatter living there that preyed on young men? Was it something devilish? He enjoyed a good ghost story, but didn't like the term haunted house. The 2 words combined sounded like something from a fair, where people dressed as ghouls would jump out and try to scare folks. It all seemed childish. He wanted to see the real thing, only because nothing really scared him, and he thought a real apparition would be a good challenge if they existed. For an 11-year-old, he really was fearless. He thought about the scary stories he would beg his dad to tell him. There were only a couple, as his dad didn't venture too far from the farm to experience much other than farm life. But he could listen to those stories every night. He laid there in silence, just smiling, gazing up at the branches covering his small shelter. The sound of crickets and other scurrying night creatures permeated the surrounding forest. The night sounds of the woods relaxed Darwin, and he didn't mind sleeping alone. But there was another sound, one he didn't recognize, coming from just outside his shelter to the left, between his shelter and that of Thurman's, a child who was about to turn 11 himself. Thurman was the silent type, quiet and stout for his age. He was becoming quite a woodsman, too. The sound appeared again, almost like the wind was whispering. But it wasn't the wind. There was no wind. No sound came from the treetops. No branches were moving on Darwin's shelter. The sound became steadier, and Darwin could almost make out a voice, or what sounded like a voice, then another. It had to be Bronco and Buster checking to see if everyone was in their shelters. Then another voice murmured along with the other two after another sound. Then they suddenly stopped. The night was as calm as it had been prior to the strange noises. Light from the moon barely peeking between the trees and the branches in Darwin's temporary home. Not enough to illuminate the inside, but enough that he could see the bluish light resting on his ceiling. Darwin relaxed and fell asleep. Buster met with Bronco the next morning in Bronco's shelter to discuss the plans for the 3-mile hike out of the wilderness, just as they always did before the boys got up on the last morning. Food, plenty of water, the path they would take, that sort of thing. They always tried to go a different way to and from the site, so the boys would know how to adapt if one of their routes was blocked. Sometimes it took longer than others to get back, but they were always back before dark. Sipping morning coffee, the men looked at each other and knew the other was thinking the same thing. Babysitting wasn't the best job they'd ever had, but it paid well, and they didn't have to unnecessarily risk their lives for it. Something they didn't know they would actually miss. Buster gave Bronco a nod, and the two men stood up, poured out the remainder of their coffee, and just then, the youngest of 10 years old, Milo, barged in. Thurman is gone, sounding like he had ran across the wilderness. He isn't in his shelter, and I checked all around the camp. Thurman and Milo had been almost inseparable since the first weekend, teaming up whenever they could for the tasks assigned to them. Boy, what are you babbling about? And why are you up? It isn't even daylight yet, blurted Buster, trying to sound intimidating. I said, Thurman, he's gone. The two men rushed out of their shelter with Milo in tow, kneeling down to peek into Thurman's shelter. The dim light from the setting moon left dots of bluish glow on the walls of Thurman's shelter. But Milo was right. There was no Thurman. Buster cursed under his breath as he looked around the speckled room. Shit. Trying to sound unconcerned, he looked back over his shoulder and spoke up. Jesus Christ, he's probably out taking a leak. Brock, go around and see if he's close. I'll keep this one here. Bronco nodded and sprinted off. It didn't take long for Darwin and the other boys to start stirring. Buster quickly called out to them, Boys, sound off. To the right of Thurman's shelter came a muffled, Darwin. To the left, Buster could hear another stifled child, Darnell. And in the circle, to the left still, another, Charlie. Milo stood next to Buster outside Thurman's shelter, and Buster thought, okay, just one missing. Not that having any missing was good, but it was better than having kids scattered all over the woods. The rest of the boys started peeking out of their wooden homes, and Buster was quick to tell them to get back inside. He looked at Milo and told him the same thing. Milo, crying, turned around and started to walk to his shelter on the other side of Darwin's. Son, stop crying. We'll find your friend. Milo nodded his head a couple of times and wiped the tears from his eyes as he knelt down and disappeared into his shelter. A couple minutes later, light was beginning to wiggle its way through the tree trunks surrounding the camp as the sun began to pop up from behind the forest. Bronco, with light footsteps, stepped into the center of the camp where Buster stood watching over the boys. He shook his head, trying not to speak much as he chose his words wisely. He isn't out there. Buster lined his brow with his thumb and forefinger as if a headache was starting to present itself to him. You sure? Brock nodded his head. Yep, no tracks in either. Buster tried to collect his thoughts, but too many were rushing through his mind. First and foremost was the safety of the orphan. The second thought was of how they were about to lose this job, and possibly be accused of wrongdoing. But he quickly put that one out of his mind. This was no time to worry about himself. Okay, one of us should stay here and keep searching for Thurman, while the other takes the boys back to town. Well, I'll stay behind. You get the boys safe and come back with help. Take the shortest route and hurry back. Buster nodded and started calling for the boys to come out. Come on out, guys. The boys started popping out one by one, and Buster noticed an excited look on Milo's face, which turned to disappointment when he saw that neither man was accompanied by Thurman. Boys, we're going to head back. Gather your things. Only what you need. Travel light. Leave everything else. Milo stood stiff as a board in front of Buster. I can't leave Thurman, with tears returning to his eyes. Buster kneeled down to meet the boy's eyes. We ain't leaving him. Brock will stay here and keep looking. I will come back with more people after I get you all out of here. We'll find your friend. Brock is the best tracker around. He was so convincing he almost believed it himself, but he knew, given the situation, they would likely never see Thurman again. But he did have hope. It was almost nightfall when Buster finally made it back to the camp. He had gathered around 9 volunteers from town to help with the search, but given how late it was getting, he could only hope that Brock was able to find the young boy, or else they would have to wait until morning to resume the search. When Buster and the volunteers entered the camp, they could barely see Bronco sitting on a log between Darwin and Milo's shelters. His face was in his palms, with his elbows resting on his knees. Buster motioned for the other men to stay put as he made his way over to his partner. Bronco looked up with tears streaming dirt-stained cheeks. He ain't here. Confused, Buster replied, What do you mean he ain't here? Bronco wiped the stinging tears from his eyes. I mean he ain't here. What else could it mean? No tracks, no sign of him anywhere. Buster wasn't trying to be smart about it. No tracks. None at all? Bronco brushed his long, oily hair over his face. No tracks at all. Not of the boy, not of any animal, nothing. I checked everywhere within a mile radius. I checked holes, inside tree trunks. There's nothing. Not even a shred of clothing. Buster put his hand on the man's shoulder. We'll find him in the morning. Bronco looked up at him with an almost terrified look. Well, I hope so. That night the men all sat around the fire in the center of the camp, making plans for the morning. Every man was to pair up and search an area, as much area as they could before the night fell again. There were whispers among the men, whispers of ghosts or demons. One even suggested the hairy wild man had got Thurman. That idea was quickly shot down. The lack of tracks proved otherwise. Maybe the one who suggested it was just trying to be funny. But they all just figured Thurman had just gone out for a pee and got lost in the dark. Again, the lack of tracks. As the moon rose higher, the blue glow peeked through the trees and dotted the ground around the gathered men, and a soft fog began to rise. Not dense, just noticeable. One of the men started making spooky sounds, trying to lighten the mood. Another man looked to be on the verge of panic. "I thought this place was familiar. That damn house is only a couple of miles from here." Bronco looked over at the man like he was crazy. "What the hell are you talking about? There's no house here. We've been all over these woods." The man's eyes kept shifting from side to side, looking past the group into the dark woods. "The Harper home, just on the other side of those trees. It's there, but it isn't always there." Buster laughed. "You're just spooked. The force can play tricks on you at night. That house is just a myth, and even if it were real, it isn't anywhere near here." The man started again, but didn't notice that Bronco had made his way behind him. Bronco quickly pulled him up from his log by the shoulder of his jacket, tearing the seam with the force in which he jerked him up, and drug him staggering away from the others. "Let me tell you something. Believe whatever ghost story you want, or haunted house, or hairy ape man, I don't care, but you keep that shit to yourself. The last thing we need is 9 scared men losing their minds out here. Because if you wander off at night, I'll let you go missing. Do I make myself clear?" The man nodded his head quickly with a hint of fear in his eyes. "Good. Now go sit back down." As the man walked away, Bronco scratched at the back of his own neck, thinking to himself, is this the best the town had to offer? Men who couldn't even handle the woods at night? He walked back to the fire and stood next to seated Buster. "I think it's time we all get some sleep. You all can double up in the boys' shelter. It won't be comfortable, but at least it's cover." When Bronco and Buster were alone, Buster asked Bronco, "Hey, Brock, didn't that Darwin kid mention the Harper house last night? Think it's a coincidence?" Bronco rolled his eyes. "Oh, Jesus Christ, here we go. Don't you go believing that shit, too." Buster laughed at his reaction and settled in for the evening. Back in town, the boy who had gone missing, Thurman, was all the buzz. Accusations arose that the instructors had done something to Thurman and cleaned up the mess. Maybe they were drunk and accidentally hurt the boy. Maybe they were killers on the run. Neighbors staying out on the road in groups talking about it in town. Darwin and his family had heard the talks of these men who hurt Thurman when they were gathering Darwin and his belongings from the church. They didn't really pay it any attention. They knew how people could get, always ready to string someone up. As Darwin's mother went to tuck him in for the evening, he confided in his mother. Bronco and Buster didn't do anything to Thurman. It was like he was there, then he wasn't. My shelter is right next to Thurman's. Those guys are so protective of us. They wouldn't let us even walk into the woods alone to even use the bathroom. His mom kissed his forehead. "Well, you're safe now. I'm sure Thurman will show up." Darwin tried to smile, but couldn't force his face to bring the corners of his mouth up. "Mom, I ain't gonna find him. He's gone." His mom raised up and furrowed her eyebrows together in the center. "You don't know that. You'll see. They'll come marching into town tomorrow with Thurman safe and sound." He tried to believe his mother, but he knew what he had heard. The sound of low murmured voices speaking in strange tongues. It didn't scare him. If anything, it intrigued him. He did feel bad for his missing friend, but he was now curious about the noises and the house he could see just past the tree line. The house he didn't mention to the instructors. The house he was looking at when he asked about the Harper house. The next morning, the local sheriff was brought into the campsite to help with the search with his deputy. It took them a while to find the place, and he admired how well the boys had done in constructing their shelters. The fire in the center was still smoldering from the night before, but there was no sign of the men that would have arrived that night. So, Sheriff Tomlin and Deputy McGowan sat by the fire, stoked it a little, and watched its red flames come to life. They sat there for about 45 minutes, waiting for someone to show up so they could help coordinate the efforts. Deputy McGowan spun his head around quickly and jumped to his feet. "Sheriff, in there." Sheriff Tomlin had heard it too and had already sprung up just behind his deputy. Both men drew their guns and headed for the shelter that belonged to Thurman. Kneeling down, the sheriff peered in, and what he saw made his stomach turn. On the ground lay two men. The one on the left was obviously deceased. His gray skin shone through the limited sunlight peeking through the misplaced branches lining the ceiling. But the one on the right, he was alive, just barely. Tomlin hurried into the shelter. He recognized the man moaning. It was the young baker's assistant from town. The young man reached up, grabbed the sheriff's sleeve, then his skin turned an awful gray and he fell silent. Tomlin scurried out of the shelter. "Deputy, you start on that side. I'll take this side. Check all the shelters." The young deputy nodded and took off quickly. After peering into the first shelter, the scene was just as the first. Then the second, all the way around until they met in the middle. Every man lay dead in 6 of the shelters. 11 men in total, including Brock and Buster. The sheriff decided that 2 of them would head back to town to fetch the coroner and anyone willing to help them bring the bodies home. The trail was too thick with growth for horses, so they would have to drag or carry the bodies the 3 miles back to town. Both men felt ill over their discovery and stopped periodically to catch their breath. Neither man talked for about a mile, as the crow flies. But finally, Deputy McGowan broke the silence. "Sheriff, I've never seen anything like that. What?" He couldn't get all the words to form properly with the thoughts in his head. Sheriff Tomlin felt his deputy's anxiety. "There's probably a simple explanation. Probably ate some poison berries or something. Let's keep moving. Need to get back to the camp to get those men home before the sun goes down." Deputy McGowan felt a little more at ease with this explanation. "Berries. Yeah, that makes sense." The 2 men returned to the camp within a few hours with the coroner and more men than they needed to extract the dead. Retrieving the very men meant to search for that young boy. Thurman. Thurman almost became an afterthought until the group walked into the center of the camp and saw a pair of young man's shoes sitting neatly on a stump by the fire. Shoes that definitely were not there just hours earlier. 4 men hurried to search the perimeter as the coroner made his way into the first shelter and quickly came back out. "Sheriff, is this some kind of joke? I'm a busy man and you drugged me out here for this?" Sheriff Tomlin, not understanding the accusation, stared at the coroner. "What are you talking about?" Coroner Harrison wasn't the kind of man who would take his time lightly. He stormed over to the sheriff and got as close to his face as he could without actually touching him. "There's nothing here." Sheriff Tomlin, even more confused, stormed over to the shelter and looked in. Then to the next, until he had searched every shelter. I don't understand. They were all here, dead. Deputy, you saw them too, right?" Deputy McGowan agreed. "Yeah, all of them. I don't like this. They couldn't have just walked off." Harrison bit back. "Well, they aren't here. I'm heading back. Thanks for wasting my time." And he stormed off onto the trail alone. Sheriff Tomlin and his deputy gathered the remaining men in the middle of the camp. Tomlin made an announcement. "Apparently, the dead walk around here," trying to be as lighthearted as he could. "But now we have to make a decision. Stay here and search for the missing men and that lost boy, or head back and leave them all to whoever knows what. Deputy McGowan and I will remain here and continue searching, but the rest of you are free to go if you choose. But honestly, we could use the help." No one chose to leave. In fact, some were muttering among themselves of how the coroner had left without lending a hand. One man offered up some information. "Maybe they went to that house," as he pointed between the trees. The house was barely visible from the camp, but it was definitely there. Sheriff Tomlin squinted and moved closer to the trees obstructing his view. Where'd that come from? Deputy, did you see a house when we were here earlier? Deputy McGowan shook his head. I can't remember. I don't think so, but I can't be sure. The bewildered sheriff crept further. Well, I guess that's as good a place as any to start searching. Maybe we'll get lucky. The sun was barely peeking above the horizon. The air began taking on a reddish hue, casting shadows from the trees toward the direction of the house. The men headed toward the house, trying to get there and back quickly before the quickly approaching night sky would darken their search completely and put an early end to it. When Darwin Moore was sworn in as the youngest sheriff of the town, he recalled the story of the men who went looking for Thurman, then the men who went looking for them. None were ever seen again. Searches yielded very little. A pair of boots here, neatly folded shirt there. But no one dared to go back into that neck of the woods aside a few short stints during the day. Some folks even named it the Hollow Forest. A plaque was erected at the entrance of the trail leading to it, memorializing the one child and all the men lost. Darwin stood looking at it, remembering Thurman, Bronco, Buster, the men who had taught him so much. Milo stood next to him as his deputy, both men in their early 20s, sharing the same memories of their time in the forest without saying a word. Milo touched the sign. Poor bastards. Could have easily been us, too. Darwin regarded him with stern eyes. But it wasn't. Aren't you even a little curious what happened? Milo spun around to face his old friend. The hell you say? I know what you're thinking, Jonathan. You aren't going in there. Leave the dead to rest. Of course I'm curious, but none of them would want us disappearing to find out. Darwin snickered, turned around, and casually walked away. Milo turned to follow him. He could always tell when Darwin was in the mood for an adventure, and it surprised him that Darwin had not thought about going into the woods before now. But he knew Darwin was fearless, but not foolish. At least he hoped not. The duo walked back to the station, made some coffee, and sat at their desks waiting for the next big thing to pop up. After all these years, the sketches of the missing men and child were still hanging on the wall. The paper they were drawn on had turned yellow, and the wall was now like another memorial to them than any hope of actually finding them. Darwin took off his hat and combed his short black hair. His pomade was getting thick and created a lather in his comb, which he wiped off on the edge of the hair gel's can. He looked over at Milo. Deputy, looks like you could use a haircut and a shave. Go see the town barber today. Milo's hair had gone from a dark brown as a child to a sandy brown as he got older. He always kept his uniform looking nice, but he would skip his own grooming once in a while. Darwin didn't wear a uniform. He liked the old West style he portrayed, a long brown duster with his badge pinned to it, black cowboy hat for the winter, and white in the summer. He wasn't the most well-groomed in the room, but he liked poking fun at his deputy for being so neat and polished. Darwin didn't get away with being a little dangerous without getting caught for this long by being stupid. Planting the idea in Milo's head that he needed a haircut was intentional. It was a way to get Milo off his back for a few minutes. Ever since they were kids, Milo had clung to Darwin as kind of a safety net, both for himself and for Darwin. He knew Darwin liked to take unnecessary risks and didn't want to see him self-destruct, even if it was purely unintentional. So he would cling to Darwin whenever he could. Darwin appreciated the sentiment, but didn't like being constantly monitored, especially by his deputy, and he expressed that numerous times. So he had to outsmart Milo. He would often send Milo out on needless runs to different farms or residences just to have some breathing room. This time, there was a plan, and it wasn't just to get some space from his longtime friend. Darwin watched as Milo left the jailhouse, then continued to nonchalantly watch him walk down the street and into the barber. As soon as he felt he was clear, Darwin grabbed the bag of supplies he had hidden in his footlocker and slipped out the back door, then made his way to the hollow forest. For so many years it had been calling for him to return, not out loud, but mostly his own burning inner voice. For justice for those lost? Officially, yes. But this was more about his own curiosity than some duty he was bound to. He didn't feel he was any more qualified to be the sheriff than the next guy, other than he wasn't afraid of much. Ghosts? Nah, they weren't real. The hairy wild man? He needed hard proof of that one, and a lot of it. An outlaw murderer? That's the likely scenario in this situation, but he carried a gun and knew how to use it. A man doesn't grow up on a farm without knowing how to shoot. Besides, why would a madman stick around a crime scene for more than a decade? Unless he just wanted to be left alone in this neck of the country. So, if there was a murderer still around after all these years hiding out in the woods, he was going to find him and kill him. That's the only possible outcome. As Darwin headed into the forest, the memories came flooding back to him of his first time in the 2 weeks after. What he had learned from Bronco and Buster, how he would take every bit of knowledge they gave him and excel with it. But he was forgetting the biggest lesson of all. Don't wander this forest alone. Since his time as a student of Bronco and Buster, Darwin had been learning as much as he could about the forest. Not just any forest, this forest. Whether from witnesses who went on the hunt for the missing people, or just listening to the stories passed down through the generations, he would separate the fact from what he saw as fiction. Being alone on this hike, Darwin could move quicker through the overgrown trail, one of many trails, but he remembered this was the shortest. As he walked, he thought of how he would begin, or what he was even looking for. Surely there would be no trace of the men and child who disappeared more than a decade ago. At the very least, he would prove there was nothing wrong with the woods and that everyone could relax again. But if trouble did come to him, he was prepared. It took Darwin just over an hour to reach the camp, and when he did, it looked almost like they had just built it the day before. Aside from the forest trying to reclaim its property, an oak tree had begun its long life in the middle of the camp where the fire pit once stood, and vines and weeds slithered up the sides of the shelters the boys had crafted. But the shelters were still mostly intact given their age. Most people would be uncomfortable going into the shelters, but Darwin didn't hesitate in entering the one he had built. With the exterior being overgrown with brush, the inside was surprisingly habitable. So he dropped his bag on the floor and exited. He looked back at the shelter and was impressed by what this 11-year-old self had created. But this self-admiration had to be put on hold. He was there for a purpose. On the first day in the camp, it wasn't his intention to go out looking for anyone who may be hiding in the forest. The others had been taken from inside the camp, except for the former sheriff and the men who went with him to the house. But he had no way of knowing that, with no survivors to tell the tale. As far as he knew, he just had to wait. His first thought, draw as much attention to himself as possible. He wanted to draw out whoever may be lurking in the thick woods, so he built a new fire pit near the center of the camp, but far enough away from the oak, trying desperately to grow as to not hinder the long life it had ahead of it. The fire needed to be so big that anyone within at least a mile would see its glowing fury. As the fire blazed, Darwin checked the other shelters, just to be sure someone wasn't going to jump out and surprise him in the dead of night. But they were empty. He sat at the fire and watched as the sun began creeping in a downward angle. Hints of its light burst through the treetops like a glowing cacophony of silent fireworks streaming down and gently kissing the earth around him, just as he remembered. Suddenly, the sound of a twig snapping came from behind him, where his shelter was located. Darwin effortlessly sprung to his feet, drew his pistol, and spun to face his would-be attacker in one swift motion. But it was just a squirrel, curious of the newcomer as it began its hunt for a winter stash of nuts. Darwin peered past the squirrel into the deep woods behind his cabin. Nothing out of the ordinary, just trees and thickets. But he couldn't help but fixate his gaze. Something was strange about it. The sun dipped further until the light was barely shining between the thin gaps in the trees. If he were outside the woods, there would still be another 30 to 40 minutes of daylight, but inside the canopy, darkness was overtaking the still forest. So still, not even a leaf flew from the treetops. No rustling, no sounds of nighttime creatures, just an uneasy feeling that he was being watched from somewhere unseen. His focus remained on the woods behind his shelter. The lower the sun sank, the stronger the feeling got. Finally, the sun was no longer. The darkness revealed a glowing moon that had been shrouded by green treetops, only visible now due to the bluish light it was projecting downward onto the camp, just as he remembered. Still, there was something or someone out there within the trees. He could feel it. He wasn't afraid. If his gut feeling were true, this is what he came here for. With his hand resting on his revolver strategically positioned on his thighs, he gazed harder into where he could once see the trees before nightfall. Specks of moonlight cascaded down all around him, outlining the leaves above. Darwin questioned his decision to make a fire so big. Now he was illuminated, and the light noise kept his eyes from adjusting to the dark tree line. Just as he had the thought, something lit up in the distance. The moonlight has a way of revealing things that could normally be missed. A house, or what looked like a house. The same house he had seen at the camp that night. There was so little of it visible that Darwin questioned it as he stared at it, squinting his eyes to try to make it out better. Small flakes of moonlight touched his shoulders and arms, breaking his concentration momentarily. He then remembered one of the stories told to him by one of the townspeople. Whatever you do, don't let the moonlight touch you. That's how they find you. He chuckled to himself and told himself that silly tales are for children. Still, there was definitely a house. He couldn't make out its condition, but it was there all the same. Confused, he knew there was no house there when he arrived at camp. He, the other boys, and the instructors had been all over this area, and they hadn't seen it until that one night. Leaving the campsite at night wasn't his first thought in his plans, but he was really just going with it and playing it one moment at a time. But there was one thing he was certain of. He needed to kill the fire. So he let it burn down a bit and threw some water on it that he had collected at the stream earlier. Smoke billowed up through the trees and made its escape into the open air above. The windless night allowed it all to travel straight up. Darwin stood by his shelter, hoping there was a better view of the house from there. Still, it was the same. Hard to tell. His loosely made plan involved just sitting at the camp waiting for something to happen, something to come after him. But that was before the house. A house that shouldn't be there. But he knew what this house was. It had to be the Harper home he had heard whispers about when he was a child. As he stood by his shelter in the dark, Darwin contemplated his next move when, from beneath his very feet and all around the ground, rose a light fog, the thickest of it creating a trail toward the house. Flecks of blue moonlight dotted the fog, highlighting its misty form. Suddenly, from behind him came a stirring in the woods beyond the other shelters. Darwin quickly spun around with his pistol aimed in the direction of the unwanted visitor. The darkness made it hard to fixate on a target, but he drew the hammer of the pistol back in preparation anyway, slowly emerging from the thick brush. "Milo, get the hell out of here!" Smoke still billowing from the fire pit blocked his view of his deputy, but the moon striking the smoke violently outlined the silhouette of his old friend. Milo slowly emerged from around the fire pit with his hands up, palms facing Darwin. Darwin lowered his weapon and slowly brought the hammer back to its resting position. Darwin, are you insane? Why? Just why? Darwin waited for Milo to get closer. I left you in town for a reason. Now I have to worry about your safety too? It's best you just head back. Milo approached Darwin. Stay out of the moonlight. That's how they get you. Darwin laughed. You believe those old bullshit stories? But Milo truly looked concerned. Superstitions or not, we have nothing else to go off of. Yeah, I've been doing my own investigations and research on this, and it wasn't worth the risk to come back here for you. Darwin knew the answer, but asked anyway. Then why are you here? To stop you from doing something that'll get you killed. Darwin smirked. Then you'd better stop me, as he turned and began heading toward the house. Milo watched as Darwin walked into the misty trail leading to the house. He thought about shooting him in the leg to stop him, but he would have to carry him back, and he knew Darwin would just return when he healed. Nervously, Milo began following his friend. This went against everything he stood for. He wasn't the adventurous one. He was usually the voice of reason, but he knew how strong-willed Darwin was and hoped Darwin would just be satisfied after a quick look around. As they pushed through the thick brush and got closer to the house, the moonlight seemed like it was trying to touch them, moving with them, but narrowly missing them. Darwin didn't believe in superstitions, but what did he have to lose by staying out of the moon's beams, other than his pride? But even he had to admit to himself that something felt uneasy about this, other than a house appearing from nowhere. The two crept up on the house slowly, keeping low to avoid being seen and hoping the fog would mask them from the moon's rays. Both men started feeling something, as if something was brushing past their feet, thicker than the grass and weeds that blanketed the landscape, but it was moving from the back. Milo felt it brush against his foot as if it were moving forward. He tried not to make any noise, but Darwin heard him cringe a little. As he turned to see what the problem was, he felt it too. Rough like the root of a tree, but there were no trees in this clearing. Darwin had to wonder what the hell he was doing here. Closer still to the house, they could see that it was run down. Holes in the roof, chunks of the outer wall missing, showing the logs behind the thin coating, and some strange moss growing up the side that looked like it was moving. Even closer, the house seemed to dim in the moonlight until it was blacker than the night sky. But in one window, they could see something reflect, and it was moving. Not shimmering, not like a light, more like a flickering candle being carried around a room. The air got colder. Late summer still had plenty of warm nights, but they could see their breath and feel the stiff frozen weeds scratching against their clothing, making sounds like corduroy pants rubbing together. The flickering light moved again. Then the sharp frozen leaves of a weed poked through Milo's pants leg. The next one cut deeper, and he could feel blood trickle down his leg. Then a third cut deeper, and a steady stream of blood ran down into his sock, soaking it in his own blood. Darwin could hear the plants hitting his duster as the air got colder and colder, and he was sure his duster would be shredded by the time they stopped. Milo limped along, still trying not to make a sound, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. Finally, they made it to the overgrown yard. Milo looked up and started frantically tapping Darwin on the shoulder. Darwin brushed his hand away and nodded. In the window, with the candle, the two could see a person, a young person, a child. Not that a child in a house was strange, but this house wasn't normal and looked like it hadn't been lived in for 100 years. Then the child stopped and faced outside the window as if he were looking directly into both men's eyes simultaneously. The moon's light shifted and illuminated both men. They froze in their tracks, as if moving would make the situation less creepy. The candle lit up the child's face in the window. Darwin and Milo gasped at the same time. It was Thurman. But he hadn't grown. He was still the same 10-year-old boy he had been the last time the pair had seen him. Darwin's stomach sank, and for once in his life, he was afraid. Some grown serial killer, he could handle that. Even the hairy man of the legends around town wouldn't be something to be afraid of. But this was unlike anything he had ever imagined. This wasn't a ghost. It was flesh and blood of a child. But there was no way he could let on the fact that he was a little afraid to Milo. Milo's own gasp had masked Darwin's, so there was no clue left out in the open. Just as the men both decided within their own heads that this was a bad idea and started to turn around to head back, the fog beneath them started changing, withdrawing itself toward the trail back to the woods. Voices started raising up from the very earth they stood on. Low, unintelligible grumblings. The same voices Darwin had heard the night Thurman went missing. Haunting sounds that dug through the cold and into Darwin's and Milo's bones. The fog rose into shapes, unmistakably once human, but not enough to form out their features. The moonlight cast into the mist that made up the being and lit them as if someone were shining a light into a glass jar. Darwin and Milo began backing away from them slowly, the bitter cold slowing their movements and their sharp edges of the frozen weeds slicing further through their clothes. Darwin's long duster wasn't much protection. Somehow the weeds found their mark within it and began tearing at him. The apparitions moved in closer, matching the speed of Darwin and Milo, staying just outside of arm's reach, glowing, trying to speak without forming actual words. The faster the sheriff and deputy backed away, the faster these entities would move to keep up, as if they were pushing them back to the house. Milo had the thought that they could run through them, rather than ending up in some trap at the house. To test his theory, he stopped backing up and moved toward one of the ghosts, if they could be called that. He reached out his hand to try to penetrate the foggy sentient, but as soon as his finger penetrated the being, his hand burned with the fires of hell itself. Darwin grabbed him and pulled him back, so hard that Milo lost his footing and fell onto the frozen ground. The weeds instantly cut through his deputy uniform and left lacerations throughout his body. He struggled to get back to his feet, and as he did so, the weeds cut further. His hands, legs, back, all torn apart. Blood pooled into his cotton uniform, revealing every spot the weeds had touched him. Darwin pulled Milo onto his feet and toward the house. Milo, tired of being silent and with labored breath, spoke. "That's where they want us to go. We can't." Darwin grabbed him tighter and pulled him harder toward the house. "We have a better chance in there than we do out here. There's nowhere else to go." By the time they reached the house, Milo had lost so much blood that he was getting lightheaded. Onto the porch, the glowing spirit stopped following them, sinking back into the ground as a fog. Milo collapsed to his knees, then backward onto the old wooden slats that made up what would have once been a beautiful porch. Now it reeked of death, decay, bowing under the very weight of Milo's body collapsing onto it. Darwin knelt down next to his old friend. "Get up!" Milo looked at Darwin with terror in his eyes. I can't. Am I dying?" It was too dark to see the extent of Milo's injuries. "No, we just need to get you inside. Stay with me, Milo." Then Darwin bent down, grabbed Milo under his arm, leaned his old friend against him, and stood, stomping toward the door while Milo's legs dragged behind them. Darwin reached down and opened the door, dragging Milo in with him. Slamming the door behind them, Darwin leaned against it with Milo's arm around him. "You okay, buddy?" There was no reply. Milo was still breathing, but his dead weight was hard to keep upright. As gently as he could, he laid his old friend on the floor of the entryway. There wasn't much light inside other than seemingly random blue bands of moonlight peering in through the glassless windows. Darwin dragged Milo into the striations of the glowing blue to take a good look at his wounds. When he got him into the light, he saw there was likely no saving Milo. He had lost so much blood that his clothes were soaked in it. Then, A fog seeped up through the mismatched rotting boards that made up the floor and surrounded Milo. When the mist retreated back into the floor, Milo wasn't breathing, and his skin had turned gray. No last gasp of air, no heroic final stand. He was just gone. Darwin felt a tear roll down his cheek, quickly wiped it away, and began investigating his own wounds. There were a few deeper cuts, but the thicker clothing he was wearing and his duster had saved him from the worst of it. Darwin knelt down over his old friend's body, removed his hat, and said a quick prayer. He felt an incredible amount of guilt for the death of his friend, but he had to find a way out of this situation and worry about that later. Then he remembered. Stay out of the moon's beams. He had just killed Milo by placing him in the moonlight. That was a thought he would have to figure out when he was out of there. He stood up, put on his hat, and surveyed the area. The house was completely unrecognizable from any inhabitable space. The floor was falling in some places. The ceiling had collapsed in others, revealing the second floor in sections. The walls were crumbling onto the floor, but there were still decorations about. A cracked face, a painting of a family which was faded to the point that even if he knew who the family was, they wouldn't be recognizable in this portrait. Darwin began moving throughout the first floor, looking for any sign of a back door, side door, anything. When nothing presented itself, he figured diving through a window would have to do in a pinch. Always know your exits, Buster had told him 1,000 times. He never forgot it. But even if he dove out of a window or burst the hinges off a door, he would be right back outside with the frozen weeds and the fog. He wasn't sure which option was better. Suddenly, a sound from above. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps. Footsteps that sounded much too heavy to be from a 10-year-old boy he had seen in the window. The footsteps moved across the ceiling just above his head and toward the other end of the house. Then another pair seemed to split off from the first and began heading toward the other side of the house. The loud footsteps trailed off as they reached their destinations, but grew louder as Darwin realized. Stairs. They were coming downstairs on either end of the building, trying to surround him. He looked down. Damn it, he thought to himself. He was standing directly in a moonbeam. He hadn't been before he heard the footsteps, but here he was giving himself away. Slowly he moved out of the light and began moving to the back of the house. The air inside was becoming just as cold as it was outside. Ice crystals began forming on the floor and walls. He could hear the footsteps slowly stomping their way down the stairs, into the opposite hallways, and into the front of the house where he had been standing in the light. He reached down for his pistol, but it wasn't there. He must have dropped it outside in the weeds when he was pulling Milo to his feet. He withdrew into a shadow between two bookcases and stood waiting for the two inhabitants to get far enough away that he could make a silent escape. The footsteps stopped in the entryway, and Darwin presumed they were looking at Milo's lifeless body. He crept out of his hiding spot and began climbing out of a window in the back of the house. As soon as his leg was out, the fog began rising on the porch, and the entities from the yard started forming, blocking his exit. There has to be a way out of here, he thought to himself. This was the most terrified he had ever been, and if he made it out alive, this would likely be the most afraid he would ever be for the rest of his life. As he brought his leg back into the window, he thought, okay, looks like I just have to keep up this cat and mouse game until the sun comes up. He began heading to the end of the house where he heard one of them descending the stairs. Going up seemed like a better option than staying down below. Slowly, he tiptoed his way through the house, being sure not to let the moonlight touch any part of him. When he reached the stairs, he wondered if he could even make it up without falling through the dilapidated boards. But he started up anyway. He hadn't heard any movement, so he must have been doing something right. He placed his foot onto the step, close to the wall to keep the center of the step from creaking. He applied pressure slowly, and it held without making a sound. Then the next stair, then the next, until he was level with the second floor landing. The sound of footsteps began again from below. Slower this time, not as deliberate as before. He tucked himself into the shadow below the window on the landing and held his breath as the footsteps drew closer. He watched as something moved toward the stairs. A child. Thurman. All he could see was the top of his head at first, but when Thurman turned to climb the stairs, Darwin got a good look at him, and Thurman was the very thing that would haunt dreams. His eyes appeared to be sealed shut, crusted closed, and his mouth was dried and cracked and hung open. His skin a bluish gray, and chunks of his hair were missing. Thurman moved slowly up the stairs, and Darwin prayed that he couldn't see him. Thurman passed Darwin on the landing and moved on to the second floor. A door opened and slammed shut. Then, silence. Darwin forced himself out of the shadow and continued up the stairs, hopefully to an attic, a nice dark attic. Remembering the roof had missing sections, but still hopeful there was a shadow up there big enough that would encase him in darkness until the sun came up. When he made it up to the attic, without hearing another footstep, he noticed there was moonlight flooding into the room in one spot, but the rest of the room just had tiny bands of it scattered in areas. But in the back corner, there was a section that was completely dark, and if he calculated it right, that spot would stay dark until the sun came up. So he made his way over to it, being careful not to break the beams of light hitting the floor from the roof. Darwin sat in the corner of the attic of the rundown abandoned house, curled in a fetal position, making sure light was not touching any part of him. The eerie moonlight was poking through the gapped boards in the roof, leaving streaks of a bluish light highlighting the dust in the air and the old wooden floor in front of him. The light stretched from one side of the attic to the other at this point, and there was no way to cross the room to the stairs without severing the connection the light had with the dark upper room of this late 18th century home. He sat trying to calm his breath and his shaking body, doing his best not to let out even the slightest sound. But he was so terrified that he couldn't control himself completely. He just hoped that he was quiet enough that nothing would discover his hiding place. Not Thurman, not the other person that he had heard, not the ghosts which could seep up through the floor and take his very life from him. Nothing. He just had to make it through the hours remaining of the night. As the moon rose higher, the light streaks shifted in an unnatural path, pulling the blue iridescent glow across one of Darwin's feet. Slowly, Darwin tried to pull his foot back into the shadow, holding his hand over his mouth. He tried to keep his balance as he shifted his weight to bring his foot back, but his fear got the best of him. A cramp in his foot caused him to slip. He crashed onto the floor. His bottom made a loud thud on the rotting floorboards, jostling a fine mist of dust from the walls and ceiling, penetrating the bands of light from the roof. His foot slid out from under him, and his leg was caught in the light cast by the almost full moon through the cracks and crevices of the roof. Suddenly, a thumping of heavy footsteps came charging up the stairs on the other side of the attic. Darwin retreated every part of his body back into the shadow and awaited the inevitable. He knew it was too late. He saw as Thurman, or what remained of Thurman, bound into the attic, ran across the room to where Darwin was hiding and skidded to a stop, moving his head around as if he were trying to use other senses to detect where the noise had come from and what the light had touched. He seemed almost satisfied that nothing was there and began to turn, until the light shifted again directly onto Darwin's face. With the strength of a full-size man, Thurman grabbed Darwin, pulled him from his spot, and thrust him onto the floor. Darwin landed on his back, fully encapsulated in the deadly moon's light. Falling, Thurman landed directly on top of Darwin and pinned him down. Fog began raising from the attic floor, surrounding Darwin. Darwin struggled, but Thurman was too strong for him. The fog engulfed him, and he felt his life slip away into the cold mist. When the sun came up, the house was gone, as were its secret victims. Today, the hollow forest is closely monitored by the townspeople. Cameras dot the tree lines, and a gate blocks the main trail into the forest. But sometimes someone is bold enough to take their chances, and they're never seen again. A memorial plaque stands at the entrance of the Hollow Forest. Every year, it gets updated with new names. Thank you for watching this compilation of horror stories meant for the Halloween season and fall and really all occasions. If you've enjoyed it, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button, like the video, and leave a comment down below as to which story is your favorite. And if I have some that you'd like to see in a compilation, let me know that as well. Until the next time, this is Gerald. Stay weird.